we are going to start with the formal proceedings. So, do you want to?
Yeah. So, thank you so much for your patience. Technology sometimes really tests, and this is something that I had already written to Professor that sometimes in our meeting this is a problem that we face. Nonetheless, our participants are here. Thank you for your patience. And let me invite Professor Bulbul Dhar James, who is Director of SNCWS and also Head of the Department of Political Science at Jamia Millia Islamia, to start the session.
Informally, I've already started it, given her a background of what we cover, and we're living in times which are so interconnected, and even in terms of we really need to make those connections. So I think it's going to weave a lot of threads together. Amanda, what you're going to present, and it's also looking at institutions. And when we say feminist institutions, a lot of times this eyebrows are raised at, what do you mean? You can't label institutions in terms of gendering them. But that's where we really need to understand that the construction has an effect on the policies, the legislation, the laws, the quotas, impacting both power relations as well as social interaction. So that's the significant bit. Though the framework is shaped between gendered institutions, institutional subjects, and the environment, it also provides an insight into how institutions can be regendered, because how we are looking at mainstreaming, or we are getting in gender budgeting involved somewhere. So it's part of the larger new institutionalism, and which is why we are interested in it and looking specifically at South Africa now. And it can be popular. I mean, I've looked at, in a part of my study in terms of policy, looked at democrats now, and how within the bureaucrats, the democrats form a large part of it in terms of how they're rising above all the gendered kind of stigmas. But it's not more than 20% of the total bureaucracy which really is the women who are there in those positions. And there's also an element of questioning those women who are there in those positions, and they're fighting, and this is at the highest level. I've looked at the Indian bureaucracy and looked at what's called the Indian Administrative Service, and it's really that, ironically, women, despite all of the talk, inhabit only 20% of the decision-making places in public and private realm. Public is much smaller in a lot of ways. So worldwide visibility is also merely 1 to 5% at the apex positions. So we have a bottom-heavy, a middle which has some, but not quite. But the top echelons are completely bereft in a lot of ways. You have tokenism, which is there, which exists at that level. So I'm going to leave it at that. And after you've discussed South Africa, we can put that in the larger perspective of maybe South Asia as well, and how we can touch on, the changing institutions in terms of, the formation of promoting, making the public more aware of feminism and institutionalism together. So without much ado, I welcome you to present make your presentation.
Yeah. Before Professor Amanda Gouws starts her presentation, let me just very briefly introduce her work to the audience. So Professor Amanda Gouws is a distinguished professor in political science at University of Stellenbosch, South Africa, where she's a National Research Foundation Chair in Gender Politics. Her research focuses on women and citizenship, women's representation, women's movement, and gender-based violence. She published widely in these areas. Some of her works include Unthinking Citizenship, Feminist Debates in Contemporary South Africa, which she published with Ashgate. She published Gender and Multiculturalism, North-South Perspectives from Routledge. Her latest book, Feminist Institutionalism in South Africa, Designing Gender Equality, is the context in which we had sort of reached out to her to engage with our students here today. She was a commissioner for the South African Commission for Gender Equality from 22 to 24. We are really privileged to have you here, Professor. Thank you so much, and over to you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. So what I will talk about today is basically based on the book that came out last year on feminist institutionalism in South Africa. So it looks at the institutions we have and, the challenges and the successes of specifically the Commission for Gender Equality. Next slide. Can we have the next slide, because I can't move the slides? Thank you. So let's start by answering this question about what is state feminism. And if we think about state feminism, is how would you introduce feminist approach or strategies into the state, and it is the promotion of gender equality through state structures. And these structures we call national gender machinery. So there's a whole body of literature on national gender machineries in different countries, and specifically Europe. There's a lot of research on Europe. So these can be committees, units, commissions, and so on. So during our transition to democracy, that was basically that negotiation phase was 1992 to 1993. Feminist scholars and feminist activists, and I was one of them, we created an umbrella body called the Women's National Coalition that really brought together different organizations, women in different parties, trade unions, and so on. So it was really a big organization on the national level. And after a lot of consultation, we lobbied for an integrated set of structures to cover the different spheres of government. And the one thing that we did not want was the women's ministry. So the reason why we oppose the ministry is that, if you look at other African countries, many of them have a ministry for women's affairs or something like that. But what happens is that everything that's got to do with gender equality just gets parked there, and there's very little policy coming out of it. And so it becomes a way of ghettoizing gender in a specific place. And that then also leave other departments off the hook to do anything about gender equality. So what we got in South Africa was one of the most comprehensive national gender machineries internationally. So our machinery was, we call it a package of institutions, and it covers both the legislative sphere, the executive, so Parliament, the Cabinet, the civil service, and then we have the Commission for Gender Equality outside the state. Next slide. So let's look at what we had at that time and what was approved during that negotiation phase. So we had an Office of the Status of Women in the Presidency, and that office had to write a national gender policy for South Africa. Took 8 years, but they did write the policy. We had a women's empowerment unit in the Speaker's office, and the Speaker was a woman and a feminist. Her name was Trini Janwala. And that unit actually trained new women parliamentarians. Up to 1994, we had one woman in the South African Parliament. So after 1994, there was a 30% quota, and I will get to that. But so there were many women coming in with no background of being in Parliament, and that unit did that work. Then there was a Joint Monitoring Committee on the Quality of Life and Status of Women in Parliament. So every civil service department in South Africa has a portfolio committee. And in that portfolio committee is where legislation is actually written, and then it goes to Parliament where it's debated. But this specific JMC, Joint Monitoring Committee, had oversight over all the other departments. So and at the moment we have one of the biggest cabinets in the world. We have 32, at the moment it's 34 ministries, so ministers plus their deputies, makes it 68, and at some count we were 72. So that's a lot of ministers. And this committee, one committee with one chair, and I think 2 additional members had to do all that work. And they did an amazing job of oversight. We had the multi-party caucus in Parliament. So this is a caucus of women coming together across party lines. But it never really worked very well because women had to toe their party lines, and so they couldn't actually form an agenda that would bring all those parties together, and it's still a struggle up to this day. And then in every civil service department, in other words, in every ministry, there was a gender desk,
and then outside, protected by Chapter 9 of the Constitution. So Chapter 9 of our Constitution are the oversight bodies. So it's the Public Protector, the South African Human Rights Commission, the Language Commission, the Electoral Commission, and the Commission for Gender Equality. And what makes this important is its autonomy, but also the fact that it comes with the power of the Constitution. Next slide. So I think why, one can ask the question, why is it important then that we have national gender machineries? What does it mean for women's representation? Excuse me. So it was really hard to get women into parliament without a quota. And during that phase of negotiation, we apart from negotiating the gender machinery, we also demanded a quota. And it was very difficult because it was the ANC Women's League that actually argued with the men in the ruling party, the African National Congress, to get a quota. And at first the men resisted, but eventually the ANC was the one party with a voluntary quota of 30%, and it changed to 50% in 2007. So we have to distinguish between descriptive representation and substantive representation. Descriptive representation is about numbers. So 30%, the first election, it was 111 women. And now we're up to 45%, so close to equal. But that doesn't mean a whole lot if it doesn't lead or contribute to substantive representation. Now, substantive representation means that these women who are in parliament really should represent women's interests, the interest of the women in their constituencies, and they should exercise policy influence. Now, I want to say that, we always say this is what women should do. I think men should do that too. Men should also represent women's interests or everyone's interests, but very often that does not happen. So there is this expectation that women should represent other women. Now, I've already mentioned the ANC Women's League, who at that time was actually had feminists in the organization, and who was... I find these little emojis very distracting. Can we just stop with that? So the substantive representation, what we wanted from the ANC Women's League, of course, was that they should continue along a feminist path, but that did not happen because, the ANC is a nationalist movement, and as we see with the national liberation movements in Africa, is that very often they maintain a platform of nationalism even after transition, and this the ANC is no different. So the ANC Women's League became a very nationalist organization and quite conservative. I mean, they have a platform of women as mothers of the nation. So they maintain women in that context of motherhood and caregiving, and they don't really pursue a gender equality agenda. They did in that first 5 years, but after that it changed. And after that first 5 years, because the feminists or the femocrats that actually went into the national gender machinery came out of the Women's National Coalition, but some and many of them were ANC members, ANC Women's League members and ANC members, but they were femocrats. They left after the first 5 years because it became very difficult to drive a gender equality agenda after the first 5 years. And then, of course, the ANC Women's League became more conservative. So it was in that first 5 years we saw the substantive representation of women in government, because that's when very important laws were made. The Domestic Violence Act, the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act, the Choice of Termination of Pregnancy Act, the Maintenance Act, and in the second parliament we completed the Sexual Offences Act. So you can see important acts, and specifically the one on abortion, because we're a very religious country and people are opposed in many ways to the choice of termination of pregnancy. But the ANC did not allow members then a vote of conscience. They just said, this is what we're going to do for gender equality. And so that act passed through Parliament, and therefore abortion under certain, the conditions for the different trimesters, but it is legal in South Africa. Next slide. So our the first president was President Nelson Mandela, then we had President Thabo Mbeki, and the third president that came to power in 2007, Mbeki was recalled and he became the president, and he was elected then in 2009 during the election. But 2006, he went through a rape trial, and that was one of the most awful secondary victimizations of a rape complainant that we have ever seen, because he was making the argument that it was consensual and that it is part of his culture, and so he invoked the cultural defense. She said it was not consensual, and then she was basically on trial. She was told that she doesn't understand the difference between consent and non-consent. She was called a serial rape accuser. She was sort of, portrayed as crazy. And after that, so this was a trial that really deeply upset the feminist community in South Africa. But after that, he came to power in 2007, and it was the ANC Women's League was the deciding voice, deciding vote. For him to become the president. So you can already see the change there in the Women's League. And part of that deal was that the structures of the national gender machinery will be rolled back, and that in its place we will get a women's ministry. So what we got was a ministry for women, youth, and people with disabilities, and I'll talk about that later. So this ministry is dysfunctional because of the mandate is too big. You have women, you have youth, and you have people with disabilities. But it's also seen as a soft option where you appoint ministers that are not very competent. So inappropriate ministers, and in 2014-15, for example, the department reached only 11 of its goals, one of its 11 goals. And that was to create an outreach program. So every year, when there is reporting to the portfolio committee, it's 30% or less of the targets that are reached. So, and if you think that South Africa is a country with one of the highest levels of gender-based violence and intimate femicide in the world, then one would ask, what is the role of this ministry in, for example, creating interventions in this really very serious problem with gender-based violence? And we hear very little. I mean, we are in 16 days now, right? We have not heard anything from the ministry yet. Then under President Zuma, who is also, was accused of very serious corruption and state capture, and then later on in a commission of inquiry found that he was instrumental in state capture. Now, what state capture is that it is a very egregious form of corruption where you use state structures and you change their mandate so that you can actually channel money into patron-client networks. And this happened on a large scale under President Zuma. So if you recapture state institutions, and this was what happened with the women's minister, the national gender machinery, is that those institutions were either rolled back or they were captured through, and specifically the ministry was captured into these sort of changing of mandates and satisfying the patron-client networks outside the government. Next slide. So this is the book. I just wanted you to see what the book looks like. And so the research in this book is then to look at what happened to the national gender machinery and specifically the Commission for Gender Equality from 1996, when the machinery was created, up to 2014, which was when, and after that, the commissioners wrote the first part, but then people who work with the commission, who are in government and who are in civil society, wrote the last chapter. So it comes up to 2020. Next slide. So I was a commissioner for the Gender Commission from 2012 to 2014, and this was, and my chapter is called "In the Belly of the Beast" because if you go back to what I've said, this is a commission that's in the Constitution. It has constitutional power, and so one would think that, and of course, it is the most important oversight body over the other structures, and it's protected in Chapter 9. So here, if we talk about new institutionalism, we talk about the stickiness of old rules. If you create new structures, but they are already old structures, then those old rules remain and very often makes it very difficult to get around them. But the Commission for Gender Equality and the whole national gender machinery was created from scratch. So there was no need for it to be nested in old structures, right? This was really a clean slate. Nothing is ever a clean slate, but as close as one could get to that. This is what happened with the creation of the CGE, and how it was positioned in terms of other structures, but not necessarily you had to embed it in old structures, because there were no old structures. This was the first time that there was an oversight body created. We remained a Westminster type of parliamentary system, but even our second house is not like the Westminster system. It's a house that's created with representation from the provinces. So 2 appointed members for each province make up the second house. And so this yes.
This commission for a bit, the sound.
Okay, where did you lose me?
About 30 seconds, so not very much.
So what I'm saying is that this commission really was, it was the first time an oversight body was created, and it could therefore develop its own rules and its own path dependencies and ways of working, and it had to create its own mandates. And this was really interesting because the first commission, so that was the first, the commission terms are 7 years, but it can vary between, I was only appointed for 2 years because the president appoints. And, in my case, President Zuma had to appoint me, and he didn't like me very much. So I got 2 years. but it can be between 5 or 7 years. And so it creates its own mandates. And the first 7 years, they were feminists. The women who went in there were feminists, and they created basically a feminist mandates for the commission. Next slide. So the way it works, and now I'm talking about the architecture, because what the book does is to say, and the subtitle is the Designing for Gender Equality, is whether the way we create these structures, whether it makes a difference to get feminist outcomes, or, can it be any type of structure? It doesn't matter as long as you have what we call critical agents in those structures. So the commission have commissioners for all 9 provinces. So we work in provinces. You don't work on a national level. We meet every 3 months, so once a quarter, all the commissioners come together. But in between times, you work in your province, and then you have a very wide mandate. You can basically have your own projects and work on those projects. But we need to ask then, if we look at the architecture of the commission. So you have the commissioners, and then you have a secretariat, and the secretariat are the people who have to do the work. They are in departments. There's a education department, legal, research, human resources. There's also IT, and if we look at this in terms of what we call gender regimes, you have to ask yourself, where do you find men and where do you find women? The idea with the Gender Commission was that in the beginning that the focus is on women's equality and discrimination against women. But then when we started the discourse of gender mainstreaming, and I know this all came from the Beijing, the different platforms of action, the UN conferences, but Nairobi and the Beijing platform of actions were very clear on gender mainstreaming. So we took that discourse and we started talking about gender mainstreaming in our organizations, also in society, and so on. And so this then changed the way that the focus of the commission, right? And so the idea then was that we would do gender and not feminism, and that's when the gender regime changed. So what we have, and this has changed, it changes every time new commissioners are appointed. But when I was there, and for quite a number of at least 7 years after I was there, it was a male gender regime. So between the secretariat and the commissioners, there's the CEO, and she has to keep everything together. So there's the CEO is a woman. She's always been a woman, but she gets a lot of pressure from both sides. So it's a very unenvious job. But the heads of the legal department, the head of the research department, the COO, the head of IT, so that cares for the IT of the institution, the auditor, the parliamentary liaison officer, and the spokesperson are all men. It leaves us with one head, public education, who's a woman. So it tells us again about that androcentric thinking, right? Women can do education. The rest are all the heads were men, and now legal has a woman, so that has changed. But so the question then also becomes is how, if you look at the Gender Commission and what you see, every time there's something to be said, the spokesperson is a man. And he's not a man who talks feminism, right? He talks a different discourse. So I think already so this architecture where you have a secretariat that does the work really hamstrings commissioners. So when I went into the commission, I had a whole project that I wanted to do, and I very quickly understood that you just can't go off and do your own thing, which I actually did eventually. I had a whole project with the network of women's shelters in the Western Cape. My province was the Western Cape where I live. And I wanted to know, how much should the government subsidize shelters versus what they are actually subsidizing? And I worked with the shelter network and the Women's Legal Centre, and we worked on this for 6 months. We interviewed the shelters, we looked at funding, we designed a funding model. And what we found then, for example, was that the government only paid 33 Rand per woman per day for shelters, while perpetrators in jail get 338 Rand per day. It just tells you the priorities. Anyway, so that was a project I did, and but not many commissioners do that. Next slide. So the mandate of the commission, there are 4 different mandates. First of all, to ensure an enabling legislative framework for gender equality. So this is the idea that the Commission would do inputs into legislation that's being made in government, and would also have oversight over that legislation. And of course, that happens. And I can tell you, for example, where it was really a success story, where the government, with 45% women, passed. It was a bill that was going to pass. I'm sure you know how this works. So you have a white paper, then you have a discussion, then you have a bill, then you have another discussion, and then finally it becomes an act. So this bill was called the Traditional Courts Bill. In our rural areas, there are traditional courts. And what this bill said is that women cannot enter those courts without male relatives, so a husband, a brother, a father, and then for transgressions, they could be sanctioned to hard labor or physical punishment, which is completely unconstitutional. All of it is unconstitutional. So it was the Gender Commission, together with the Alliance for Rural Democracy. So this was a group of women's organizations and men's organizations and legal organizations coming together, and 7 of the provinces who said this cannot pass. This act. This cannot become, it's completely, unconstitutional, but it's also, that was a case where the Commission worked really well. Then the second mandate is to protect and promote gender equality through education and awareness raising. So that's the work that the Secretariat, the Education Department does. Then to monitor state compliance with regional and international treaties. And the fourth one is to build an effective, efficient, visible, and sustainable institution. So you can see all of this is wide, it's big, and it will take concerted efforts. There is a raised hand. I take note, but I think there will be question and answer time. Or is this now for clarification?
No, you can complete your presentation, and we are going to take the Q&A later. Yeah. Okay,
all right. Thank you. So what happened in the time I was there is that we were normally the departure of commissioners is staggered, but at that point there were only 1 commissioner left. So we were 9, and 8 of us were new. And what we discovered is that this commission did not have the necessary documents and rules to formalize its work. There were a lot of unspoken informal rules, but nothing that's really written down. So we wrote a commissioner's handbook so that commissioners can know what to do when they come into the organization. We wrote an IT policy. We wrote a policy on sexual harassment. We wrote a whole lot of policies. But that means 80% of our work goes into mandate number 4, while I would say that the other mandates are they are actually more important. But you cannot have an organization that's sort of not functioning because there are no written rules. So that's what we did. And of course, in South Africa, trade unions are very strong. So the Commission has a trade union for the Secretariat. And they actually were very upset with the Commissioner's handbook because they did not like how the division of labor looked like in that handbook. And so there was a whole issue then with the trade union. But at least we then formalized some of these rules and the path dependencies for the organization. Next slide. Now, what is important, of course, is that the Commission for Gender Equality Act demands independence of commissioners. It says when you're appointed as a commissioner, you have to be autonomous and non-partisan, so not belong to any party. But in the time I was there were, out of the 9 commissioners, the chair, and again, you see the male regime, the chair of the commissioners was the only man. He became the chair. And two women commissioners, of which I was one, did not belong to the ANC Women's League. So you can see the influence then already of the League. So this prevented criticism of government, right? Because the ruling party is the ANC. So there's a lack of autonomy. Next slide. So there was also a refusal of an epistemic community. Now, what that means is that one would think that the commissioner does really this important oversight work, but also making inputs into legislation would work with experts like academics. And there was no willingness to do that. And so when I became the commissioner, there was the case of the CGE monitor. And this was a group of civil society, women's organizations coming together and say, we're going to monitor the CGE's work for the first 100 days of these new commissioners. And there was a huge outcry from inside the commission to say, we are not accountable to civil society, we are accountable to government. And of course, you can imagine that civil society thinks that the commission will work to deal with the problems in civil society, right? But the commission just said we will not pay any attention to the CGE monitor because we are accountable to government. And the reason for that is that our budget comes through the ministry. It first came through the Department of Justice, and then it came through the Ministry for Women, Youth and People with Disabilities. So we get our money, the commission gets its money from government, so it feels that it cannot really, it's accountable to the hand that gives them the money. And of course, party loyalty played a big role here. And just to give you another example of this sort of not wanting to criticize the ruling party, and specifically the government. So the president President Zuma was on a national platform on television where he talked about the fact that his daughter was getting married and that he's really glad she's getting married because the only way that women can become good mothers and have training for motherhood is through marriage. So I then wrote a press release to say that, we're glad for the president that his daughter is getting married, but as head of state, it's very problematic that he see this as the only role for women, that this is not the only role and that there are women who choose not to have children. There are LGBTIQ couples who want children but cannot have children. So there are a lot of different issues around motherhood, and that he should try to be more sensitive towards gender equality issues. So the chair of the commission then said, well, no, we cannot speak to the president in this way. We cannot have this in the press. We will talk to the president. But the very next week, the opposition party then laid a complaint against this. Now, once a complaint is made at the commission, it has to be investigated. And it took 2 years to investigate this. I mean, how difficult can it be? What takes so long? And then I was already not at the commission anymore when I saw a little article in the newspaper saying that the commission spoke to the president and that the contents of the discussion won't be revealed. So that is, that sort of idea that we cannot criticize the ruling government. Next slide. So, as I said, in the first 5 years, there was a feminist discourse, there was a feminist praxis, and there is a historical continuity that's linked to contestation around the issue of feminism in the CGE. So while feminist beliefs and practices guided the work of the commissioners for the first commission, there was this discursive shift towards gender mainstreaming and also the idea to include gender issues in government policy making. And this led to a more technocratic language of women's empowerment. So what's talked about is empowerment, and then you have these tick boxes, right? So that we do this, that we do that we contributed here and there, and then we say now we've done women's empowerment. And it's looking at that relationship between men and women, and there is an discourse now also, of course, that men are the victims of gender discrimination. So right now, it's not a feminist space, right? It is a space that is really very technocratic in that sense. Next slide. But I don't want to say that everything is bad about the Commission for Gender Equality. They are policies and policy contestation, and what the Commission is really good with. And you can go and look at the year annual reports. They deal with up to 200 complaints a year, right? And the head of the legal department deals with those complaints, and he very often go to court. He sits through court cases, or members of his staff sit through court cases, and they do really actually very good work in that regard. Also good work with public hearings. So in my time, we did a public hearing with the SAFA, the South African Football Association, that paid women footballers much less than men. And if any of you maybe follow South African soccer, is that last year, South African soccer, women's soccer, made it onto the world stage. They were one of the best teams, and they were still being paid less than the men. Then they went on strike and they refused to play. And then it became a big issue, which meant that the problem, even then, when we had that public hearing, was that the Commission doesn't have teeth to take it further, right? So now we've said to the Soccer Association, you have to pay your women's soccer players better, and you have to come report back 6 months later what you've done. And they come back and they've done nothing, and they say, well, we're not going to pay them better. Then what you do? Because it's not in the power of the Commission. The Commission then can make a referral somewhere else, but it's not in the power of the Commission to do anything. So you can have these public hearings and you can raise consciousness, but there's a lack of teeth. We had a public hearing on employment equity, same story. Some companies came back and reported they did something and others didn't do anything. We also have the power to subpoena. So if somebody has to, or a company has to, or an organization has to appear in front of the Commission and they refuse, then you can actually subpoena them to come to the Commission. So it has no follow-up teeth. They have a teeth to follow up. But I can also say, for example, I had a public hearing with the police in the Western Cape. So what happened was that we have a phenomenon here called corrective rape. And this is straight men who rape lesbian women to make them straight. It's a terrible concept. I don't like using it, but a mother came to the Commission and said that her daughter was, and we have a lot of lesbian women being killed as well. So her daughter was raped and killed, and that the police is not investigating the case. So this was in my jurisdiction. So I then followed up. I went to the police station. I met with the police commissioner. And I said to him, what are you doing about this case? And of course, I'm a woman. He did not like the fact that a woman was telling him how to do his work. So I said to him, okay, but I would like you to do something. And if you don't cooperate, I will call a public hearing. And he refused to cooperate, so I called a public hearing. And in that room was myself and members from the Secretariat, members from the police, and the mothers of a couple of lesbian women who were killed, as well as young lesbian women who made themselves very vulnerable because now they could be identified. But it was that important for them to be there. And they told their stories about the fact that these cases of their daughters are not being investigated. And I then extracted some promises from the police to say they will look into this. And I gave them 6 months. And of course, by the time that 6 months was over, I was not with the Commission anymore. But the point is, nothing happened. There was really no progress in any of those cases. So, and again, that's the problem with the teeth, right? Next slide. Just go back one. Okay, no, sorry, that is the one. Okay, then this is now the last slide, I think. Just go to the next one. Okay, so what I've talked about here is of course, the focus was on the Commission for Gender Equality, but in the context of a national gender machinery that was rolled back But that had so many opportunities to start in a new space, create new mandates, and so on. So what it shows is that institutions matter, but that their architecture also matters to determine feminist outcomes. At the time of its inception, the CGE operated in a dense institutional environment, having to secure its own mandate in relation to the national gender machinery, at the same time that discursive shifts away from feminism to gender have depoliticized feminist activism. So while the CGE was not encumbered by the stickiness of old rules, it created its own logic of appropriateness in relation to its accountability to Parliament and Commissioner's relation to its own Secretariat. This logic focuses on accountability to Parliament and not to civil society. And I mentioned the fact that the budget comes from the ministry. It makes it more difficult to act with urgency on matters of gender inequality that requires the CGE to be visible and taking a stand, something that is continuously criticized for by civil society. So what happens here, if you go back to those 4 mandates that I showed you, so it's structured and there are target dates and you have to do certain things throughout the year, which means if something happens, and let me give you an example. 3 years ago, a young African woman student called Uyunene, she hails from the Eastern Cape, but she was studying at the University of Cape Town. Her mother sent her a care package to the post office. And she went to pick up this care package. And in the post office, it was around closing time. She was, the guy who worked there grabbed her, he raped her, and then later burnt her body in a different place. So she went to the post office to pick up a parcel, something that all of us do at some point, and she got raped and killed. And this was a huge outcry. The next day, there were 5,000 people in front of Parliament, outraged about the violence, right? And it was, asking the president to come out and speak, and a women's ministry to come and speak. And that continued for 2 days. There were people in front of Parliament that were really very angry. And the commission was quiet, nothing. So this is the problem. When you stick to the mandates, you have to work with a secretariat. You cannot go out there as a commissioner and get on a podium and say things. I mean, I was never able to do that. Right? I have my projects, but they were projects, and I had to get a budget for those projects. But it's not the type of space where you can, just as a commissioner, feel that you have the support to say something, right? I mean, the Parliament is in the Western Cape. I mean, when Uyunene died, I wasn't at the commission anymore, but one would think that the commissioner for the Western Cape would come out and say something. And so this is civil society's problem. It says that this is a Mickey Mouse organization. It has no validity. It has no relevance. And then you have the last couple of years incredible infighting between commissioners. And I just think that it's a very cumbersome architecture that really makes it very difficult to get things done quickly and to be relevant in the moment. And of course, all commissions that are in the Chapter 9 body of the Constitution works in this way. So I guess this is just the architecture of commissions, but it is, in my mind, quite problematic. Thank you.